that white snow looks like a nice flat surface. But of course, when you do your low passes to make sure that there's no obstructions, I mean, that's helps a bit, but it's not until you touch down that you find out there may be snow drifts or whatever. And, for instance, with the Twin Otter, they're very susceptible to what they call a Station 60. And that's one of the front bulkheads that the nose landing gear strut attaches to. And I've seen, I don't know how many, I mean, it's a big normal thing that you come across, is they hit a snowdrift and it buckles the bulkhead. And of course, now we're talking structural repairs. So this is something from an operations perspective, you don't want to be stranded in the frozen north, right? And even if you can fly out, now all of a sudden you've taken the aircraft out of commission. So
hi everyone, I'm Annalisa from C.A.C. Global Solutions. Welcome to another episode of Storytime with Bret, where Bret and I discuss different experiences that Bret has along his career in his 40 plus years in aviation. And today, Bret, welcome. I would like to talk about something that we watched. So some weeks ago, probably even a month ago, we watched a documentary that I randomly found on YouTube, on the internet. We have no affiliation or association with this channel or anything, just a video that popped up on my YouTube. And this documentary was about operating Twin Otters in the frozen north of Canada. Okay, in the very specific environment. And they were showing a military Twin Otter, and they were showing a civil Twin Otter where an operator was moving tools, fuels, and stuff like that in these remote areas. I found it fascinating, first of all, because that kind of environment is not my environment. Being from Europe, from Italy, that kind of freezing cold is not something that I'm familiar with, and I find it fascinating. But also, I know you worked in that kind of environment. I think Yellowknife or Resolute, those areas. So I wanted to pick up your brain on these kind of operations in the extreme conditions, harsh conditions. I don't know how you want to call it, because in my little experience with air carriers, but also with helicopters, you can see how the environment really changes the operations and how you have to evaluate different aspects. What are your thoughts? What is your experience?
Absolutely. The thing that caught my interest, of course, is like you mentioned, I've worked in Resolute Bay and in Yellowknife. And I mean, Yellowknife, one would argue, is not that remote, but for a lot of people from Europe and the US, it would still be considered remote. I mean, I drove back and it was 21-hour drive back to Calgary from Yellowknife, and there's not much in between. So, but yeah, it struck a chord because when you're there working in these remote areas, you're very much left to your own devices. I mean, of course, there are always controls in place, but you run up against a lot of challenges that you wouldn't normally expect in normal operations in America or Europe, for that matter. In that, you go up with a plan. You're going to operate the aircraft in a harsh environment, like you mentioned. I mean, the temperatures, they can be 30 degrees below, and actually, or colder. And I mean, Fahrenheit and Celsius meet at -32. So it doesn't matter if you're thinking Fahrenheit or Celsius, it's cold. And, in that environment, your prime concern is to keep everything heated, because if you let the airplane freeze overnight, chances are, or the helicopter, chances are in the morning, you're not going flying. As a matter of fact, it might be a day or two before you go flying, because you're going to have to warm it up to the point where you can get things operating again. I mean, aircraft engine manufacturers, they put limits on how cold you can operate the aircraft, the engines. And so, I mean, oil gets so thick and just all kinds of things happen, right? So you have to warm up the aircraft enough that the engines will start, that the avionics will work and things like this. And to do that, your support equipment has to work, right? So you've got heaters, you've got ground support equipment. I mean, I used to be one of the first things I would do. We had a shed that we parked, or we had a bulldozer in. And the first thing I would do in the morning is and when I say morning, we're talking permanent darkness. I mean, it's dark 24 hours a day, basically. And the first thing I would do is open up the shed, start up the bulldozer, and drive it outside and clear the snow away from my work area around the aircraft. And then after that, you drag out the heaters and you hook up heaters with big hoses to the aircraft, one in each engine, one inside the cabin, just trying to get things warmed up enough that you can start the engines and get things running, right? But that's a fixed base operation, like a lot of people wouldn't recognize, right? I mean, leading up to that, just the idea of working in a remote area, and again, now this doesn't really matter whether you're working in the frozen north or whether you're working remote on the back of a boat with a helicopter, or whether you're operating a Twin Otter in remote tropical conditions. I mean, the Twin Otter is probably one of the most versatile aircraft in the world. And I mean, we're talking most primarily about Twin Otter right now, but I mean, there are a lot of aircraft that are operated in very different environments. And that's kind of, I think, what caught us and we were so intrigued about and wanted to talk about is working in these remote conditions, and sometimes harsh environments. And the harsh environments might mean the extreme cold. It might mean heavily salt-laden environments. Working with an aircraft that's operating in an ocean environment on the back of a boat or on floats into Bali or something, or the Cayman Islands or anywhere really. I mean, so a number of things you have to consider in doing that before you even get there and start operating the aircraft. If you're managing the aircraft, you really have to stop and think about what it is you're trying to get yourself into. Because there are all kinds of decisions that have to be made as far as, what equipment's available, what personnel you're going to need available, the type of personnel. I mean, operating in these environments, it's quite interesting because a pilot is not just a pilot, and an engineer is not, or a mechanic is not just an engineer or a mechanic. You're now the person that's managing. Well, like I said, you start up a bulldozer and clear the snow away. That's a job that you're going to do. The pilots are going to be in the north, probably caching fuel, which means loading 45-gallon drums, big barrels onto the aircraft by hand, and then again offloading them somewhere remote by hand, or on floats. I've seen all kinds of equipment and personnel and such loaded into aircraft on floats. And I mean, going from the dock onto the aircraft, it's a little precarious, and usually there's not somebody else coming to do it. It's the aircraft crew that's doing it, right? You have to think about, the equipment that might be required, the type of aircraft, how they need to be equipped. I mean, the Twin Otters, in a matter of very short time, we changed the Twin Otters from wheels. So the seasons change very quick in Yellowknife, for instance. We would have the aircraft on floats. And it seemed like a month later, it was on wheels because it was starting to freeze up. And then a month later, it was snow. So you change from wheels over to skis or wheel skis. And I mean, those were the only options available because your conditions changed so quickly there, which I think was a good example of how versatile you have to be in that kind of environment, right? The other thing, like I mentioned, the equipment that you take with you, like what about parts and tools and things of that nature? I mean, you're there by yourself. There's usually not a lot of resources that can be brought in. If working in some environments, like there may be support aircraft that come in, but not very often. And if the weather's down, they won't come in, period. So you're there by yourself, perhaps for another week or so before your supplies come in, or parts. I've seen aircraft operated in Africa, helicopters, where now there you're dealing with logistics of getting things there, parts, equipment, tools, and then they'll get hung up in customs in a foreign country like Africa, or even in North America or the Caribbean. I've seen a Boeing 757 need an engine in the Cayman Islands. So air carrier was there, and for whatever reason, they needed an engine brought in. It was interesting because they brought an engine in. It was great. It took them a week to line it all up and get it there. They got there, and there was no equipment available on island to offload the engine off the aircraft that they brought it in from. So yeah,
Ah.
yeah. So that aircraft ended up flying away with the engine on it, in it.
Oh,
That
wow.
yeah, and the 757 sat there for I think it was 2 or 3 weeks more before they could figure out how to do it, right? Just the logistics. And that's I mean, you're talking about flying into an international airport. One would think, and obviously somebody did, that, oh, we'll just send an engine down there. But there's a lot more to it than that, right? You have to really consider this. And a lot of these things, one would think in today's world with SMS that you'd be looking at all of these items through your change management program. But obviously, not everybody can think of everything, right? So,
Yeah, and it's interesting this example that you just gave, because to me it's where flight operations has their own considerations to do, but also maintenance has their own consideration to do. So you need the tools, you need the people that can do the engine change, but also under a flight operations point of view, if you bring the engine down via airplane, it's going to be a big airplane that is bringing the engine to you. So is the runway long enough? Do you have the infrastructure, the facilities to do all of that? I find it interesting.
yeah. Well, see, that's exactly it. Like, you have to think beyond that too, because I mean, clearly the runway was long enough to bring an airplane in with an engine in it, but nobody thought beyond that. Okay, we got the engine there. Now what, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, you have to think about things like engine cradles and stuff as well, because you can't just normally hang an engine using a forklift, which may be readily available in an environment like that. We've seen actually crashes happen because people hang engines using forklifts and damage the engine mounts and such, right? So these are all very critical things that have to be thought about. And, it's so whoever's managing the aircraft, it's good for them to have experience in remote operations and what's involved, and not even think about these things, even if you have the experience in isolation. Like this things like that require a team to sit down and put their heads together and really think it out, right? I mean, yeah, you're going to need flight operations to figure out the logistics of getting the engine down there. Planning, maintenance, they're all going to have to work together to find an engine, and once we've got the engine, okay, ops, how are we going to get it there? And once we get it there, who's going to hang it? Do we have the equipment to do it? Do we have the equipment, again, simply to get it off the aircraft that's bringing it in, right? I mean,
Yeah.
these are all these seemingly normal things that you would think about, but in the absence of being in a situation where you run into extraordinary circumstances, nobody thinks about those things.
Yeah, and I also found it interesting. You were telling me when we were discussing this possible topic, that you were managing a team of people, and you noticed that the performance wasn't that good. But one of the reasons is that if you are outside doing some small maintenance, you can't have your gloves on all the time. You have to get your hand out of the glove and trying to do what you're trying to do, but then your hands would freeze. So that is going to slow down the performance of a task. So something that in a normal environment would take 10 minutes now is taking 20 minutes.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that example, I had a maintenance crew that was my night crew, and their responsibility was they would see the Boeing aircraft in at night. They would, in wintertime in Edmonton, -30 at night, you have to keep heat on the aircraft all the time. There's no question about it. You're going to run into problems if you don't. So they would be their job was to babysit the aircraft through the night, rectify any defects and such. And I would give them a work package, and I the next morning I would come in and my office job, and I would review the work package and see what the guys did overnight. And I wasn't real convinced that they were doing what I thought they could do, because I've done it all in a hangar, right? And it's what I couldn't see a reason why they were taking so long. So I came in one night, 1 a.m., -30 out, and these guys are on the top of a van on a platform under an engine, changing a fuel control unit. And you've got little nuts and bolts and stuff, and it's -30. You can't manage the nuts and bolts and such with your, like you said, with your gloves on. So you have to take your gloves off. Well, you can only take them off so long before your fingers freeze and you can't feel what you're doing, never mind use your fingers anymore. So, and you got to go inside and you got to warm up and then come back out. And if you drop a nut or a bolt, it bounces off the platform and off into nowhere, into a snowbank. And now you're rummaging around for this piece that's out there, because I mean, yeah, you may have spares inside the van, but you can't leave FOD laying around either, right? So,
Right.
so all that to say that, they were doing what they could given the circumstances. And I think even as management, you have to recognize that and you have to account for it. So after that, I thought twice about the work packages I was putting together for these guys and the circumstances, of course, that they're working under. And it gives you a different perspective. You really have to think about these things. Likewise, I've operated in an area with Twin Otters on floats, and it's not freezing, but you drop a tool or a piece of hardware or a part or something, and there's a splash. So then, I mean, if you're lucky, you can dig out a magnet on a string and you can fish it out. That might take a while, or it might be gone forever.
Right.
All of these remote work areas, they all have their challenges, right?
Yeah, I find this very fascinating, and I hope our audience feel the same way, because there are so many little things that you don't understand, that you don't think about it, that you have to, oh, okay, I have to account for this, and that. Under a flight operations point of view, obviously I can't talk too much because I'm not a pilot flying in these remote areas, but based on this based on this documentary that maybe we'll leave the link for people to watch so that they can understand what we're talking about. It's like you said, the pilots are more than just pilots. They have to do more tasks to get the job done. And I find it fascinating how they fly into these areas where, in the summer you have a lake, and then in the winter it's just ice and snow,
Right.
and how they rely on Aboriginals, for example, to um, find the way through the environment, and have like a runway with these snowmobiles laid out for them so that they can land. And also because you don't know exactly if the ice is solid enough for
Mhm.
the airplane to land safely or what, right? But also
Right.
under an aircraft management point of view, from my perspective as a airworthiness, I experienced this going from air carrier commercial operations to like helicopter operations in remote areas where, okay, now you have to clean up the maintenance program, the maintenance schedule good enough so that when you're away and it's clean. And the only thing in theory that you will have to manage are possible defects or issues, right? And make sure that they have the tools and the materials minimum to do the normal weekly tasks. But also, like you said, if it is freezing cold, then you don't have the full manpower capability to do like 10 tasks. Maybe now they can do only 3 because this
Mhm.
is what it is. So you manage the work package in a different way, right?
Right, right. Well, absolutely. I mean, from a planning perspective, it all has to be taken into account. But interestingly, a couple of things you touched on. Um, for operations, flight pilots flying into some of these areas, from the air, and this is something only somebody that's done it can speak to firsthand. But from the air, all that white snow looks like a nice flat surface. But of course, when you do your low passes to make sure that there's no obstructions, I mean, that's helps a bit, but it's not until you touch down that you find out there may be snow drifts or whatever. And, for instance, with the Twin Otter, they're very susceptible to what they call a Station 60. And that's one of the front bulkheads that the nose landing gear strut attaches to. And I've seen, I don't know how many, I mean, it's a big normal thing that you come across is they hit a snowdrift and it buckles the bulkhead. And of course, now we're talking structural repairs. So this is something from an operations perspective. You don't want to be stranded in the frozen north, right? And even if you can fly out, now all of a sudden you take the aircraft out of commission. So a bit more attention, and I'm sure when they get there in docks for flying into these remote areas, they talk about all of these things. But from a maintenance perspective, now it's something you have to deal with fixing the aircraft. But from a planning perspective, you're going to have to think, okay, how can we get this airplane back into service? And so a lot of planning happens for unexpected circumstances. And remote areas, they bring into account all kinds of considerations that people hadn't thought about, right? So and the equipment might not always be there. For instance, if you have a hot section, you have an engine problem, and you end up changing a hot section on a turboprop aircraft in a remote area, you may not have the fixtures that the type certificate holder says that you need to hold the parts while you're removing them from the aircraft and the stands or whatever. And I've seen aviation inspectors write people up for not using the type certificate holder approved stands. Well, if you're in a remote area, a lot of times you work with what you have, and helicopters work in remote areas. You may be doing an engine change or a gearbox change out in the woods somewhere and have a tent over top of you. And it might not be the dead of winter, it might be in the summer, but now you're dealing with insects and all kinds of things. And it's just, and even the human factor of it all, working in a remote environment. I, as principal inspector for a helicopter company, working in a remote area, I went in one day and I was talking to the manager there, asking him how everything was. And he says, well, we had a little bit of excitement here last night. And I said, oh, what's that? Well, there was an aircraft, a helicopter, working in a remote area with just an engineer and a pilot. And for whatever reason, something happened with the pilot and he snapped. And he was working in a remote area like this, there's bears. So they carry a gun on board, a rifle. And the pilot's chasing the engineer around the helicopter with this rifle, threatening him. And in the end, he starts shooting the helicopter.
Oh, God.
Yeah. So, I mean, to me, I don't know if that's being in a remote area too long, or maybe they had some fatigue, whatever. I'm sure there are lots of excuses that could be brought up or thoughts about it. But nonetheless, it's a harsh environment, not only from a climate perspective or a geographic perspective, but from a human factor perspective, right? I mean, you're asked to do things that you wouldn't ordinarily do, and that can take its toll. I'm not suggesting that things like that are going to happen, but it puts you, like I struggled with talking about this a little bit, because in these remote areas, sometimes you have to do things that you wouldn't ordinarily do. You have to use equipment that you wouldn't ordinarily use. You have to step outside the box a little bit. And for somebody that holds their values, that you stick to the regulations, you stick to the way things are supposed to be and they must be, it makes you very uncomfortable to step outside of that. So now you start questioning yourself, and but you know what? If you're in a remote area and you have to get out, your own survival could count on that. So, I can't say one way or another. I just know that it's a harsh decision to be made on your part, and a lot of people struggle with it.
Yeah, and I like that you touched on the human factor part slash fatigue, because you put yourself in a situation where, for example, in some period of a period of the year is always dark, and a period of the year is there is always light. So even your rhythm, how you sleep, is not the same. Temperatures are definitely different from what we would say standard and comfortable temperature that we are all used to it. So it takes it brings in also the environment becomes kind of a stressor factor, right? And
Oh,
also
absolutely.
that, like you said, that you have to get things done. And it's not always easy, because aviation is made of very complex processes, right? So since you are also a former civil aviation inspector, so do you think these kind of operations would benefit more from a more customized, tailored regulations?
I don't know
Is
that you
it something that
can.
is possible?
Yeah, well, that's just it. I mean, I don't know whether you can customize it, because there's so many different circumstances that can happen. I mean, you can live a lifetime working in that environment and never come across the same instances twice, right? So
Hmm.
how do you account for all of that? And the other thing about it is regulation has to be such that it keeps you safe, but there also has to be latitude to allow you to do what you need to do. I mean, of course, the safest aircraft in the world is one sitting on the ground. But that's not the answer. That's not what aviation's about. So there's always going to be risk. And I guess the key is, and this is what most authorities are focusing on today, is identifying the risk and mitigating the risks, right? And I think that's kind of what we're talking about right from the start of this conversation is, it's not that you're not going to do these things, that flying in different environments, but you have to identify the risks and put whatever mitigations you can in place to reduce the risk to an acceptable level. And then, even then, you're subject to circumstance, right? So,
Yeah, right. And the other message that we always try to put out there is that, because we all do risk assessments all the time, even when you are driving your car from your house to the supermarket. Okay, here there is going to be traffic in this hour, so I'm gonna drive out at a different time. That is kind of of an assessment, and we do this all the time in aviation with everything we do. So the important thing is to formalize also that assessment, meaning put it on paper, right?
yeah. I mean, you're absolutely right. We do risk assessments every minute of every day. I mean, you cross the street, you do a risk assessment. You look both ways, it's safe, you go. You look both ways, it's not safe, you don't go. That's a risk assessment. Um, and I do know some regulators, though, that get hung up on, well, risk assessment. And I do know some people, in my opinion, use risk assessments to do something that they shouldn't do, but they need to justify it. So they can sway the outcome. But in my mind, a good, true risk assessment, when a hazard, a true hazard, has been identified, that's the time to perform a good, honest risk assessment and document the outcome of it. And that will save you most every time. If nothing else, it gives you kind of what in government they refer to as a sober second thought. When you see something in writing, it makes you think, oh, geez, it puts a bit more credence in what you're looking at.
Yeah, and also is good information for training purposes. This happened, this is how we managed it. Put it in your bag, just keep that in
Absolutely.
mind. It's all good information, and the people who are coming, whether are new pilots or new maintenance engineers, they can learn from it.
Absolutely.
So now it comes to we come to the end of our episode, and I would like to ask you this question. So why would anybody do this kind of job, whether it's a pilot or an aircraft
Well,
maintenance engineer, an apprentice, that, yeah, I want to go in the frozen north and see how that is like. Why?
Well, for some people, it's a personality thing. I have a good friend with Transport Canada that worked in the frozen north for years, and I think he loved it. It was just his environment, his thing. Um, it used to be when I was young and as an apprentice that the good jobs, the corporate aviation, the airlines, they wouldn't talk to anybody unless you had some experience first. And the only place where you could get experience was going where nobody else wanted to go. So
Oh,
you ended up in a lot of remote areas and a lot of jobs that nobody else really wanted. At least the experienced people, they were getting out of there, right? So there was that. But in today's world, I think it's more just choice. It's personality because things have changed in the industry such that I've seen whole classes from different aviation schools get taken up by the airlines and such. I mean, they can go directly into taking care of a Falcon Jet or a Gulfstream or Global or whatever straight out of school, which when I was young, that was unheard of. Or into the airlines. Some of the guys I went to school with, they got into the airlines, but even then, they would have to go to the bases where nobody else wanted to be, So
right.
you put in your time and then you transfer out and things like that, but it's not that way anymore. So it's really got to be a choice. I know I was principal inspector for some remote areas in northern British Columbia, and a lot of those people, they love living in that area, and so that's for them. They hunt, they fish, they like the remoteness and being away from people, and it suits them fine. So
Yeah.
it's everybody's different, right?
Yeah, I think though the amount of experiences, amount of maybe I don't know weird things that you're going to experience and see, I think it's unbeatable. I mean, I can imagine
Oh,
just the experience that you would gain from something like
oh,
that.
absolutely. I mean, I started in corporate aviation, and I was there 5 years, and then I left there, and I ended up in working remotely in the north. And I tell you, in the first 6 months, I probably learned more than I did in the first 5 years in corporate aviation. It was just, if you want experience, you're on your own. If something breaks, you're it. And that doesn't just mean with the airplane, it means support equipment, it means figuring things out, logistics, everything. I mean, you can't get everything packed in one place like that too often.
Yeah, fascinating, fascinating. Well, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and your experience. I find this very fascinating. I love it. I hope our audience, you guys, like this too. And if you want to share your experience, feel free to leave a comment. And if you enjoy our channel, please consider to like, share, and subscribe. It will help us to grow the channel even more. And thank you so much, and see you next time. Thank you. Bye.